Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Vikintas and other organizers, for inviting me to present my research on forest spirituality in the Netherlands. So I'll start with a brief background on myself and the reasons for this research, then some basic data on the context of the Netherlands, and then I will explain my toolkit, so to say, the conceptual framework for studying forest spirituality, which consists of 10 dimensions. And I explain how I applied these dimensions in my research in the Netherlands. Then I will end with the research results, conclusions and recommendations. My own background is in tropical forestry and religious studies. I worked and lived in the Global South in field projects and in international cooperation projects. And I have always been triggered by the variety of religious and spiritual views and values that people held towards forests and nature, and also how these values played out in day-to-day practice. So this became the focus of my PhD research, which finally concentrated on spiritual values in forest management. My research was triggered by the observation that spiritual values have appeared more and more in global policy documents related to forest. The Biodiversity Convention, Forest Europe, IUCN, IPBES and certification schemes. And this is often advocated by indigenous peoples organizations who gradually gain substantial influence in these policy fora. But how do these documents and the debates relate to the practices on the ground? Well, in the Global South, there is a lot of literature about spiritual values in forests, but in the Global North, not so much, until recently. Now here too, the insight is growing that connectedness with nature is important for human health and well-being. We also see a growing involvement of the public in forests and a growing demand for spiritual experiences and practices in the forest. So this puts pressure on the forest managers. They need to respond to demands and claims, but we do not know how they cope with these pressures and what support they would need. Now, focusing on the Netherlands, first here are some basic figures and issues affecting the Dutch forests. If you look at the map, you can see the green areas, which are forests, mostly in the southeastern part of the country, which is slightly higher and has sandy soils, mainly soils. The red parts are cities and built-up areas, which are mostly in the western and northern parts, which are lower and more fertile. We have a population of 18 million people and a population density of 416 per square kilometer, so that is very high. This poses a high pressure on space. Our forest cover is 11% of our land area, and that consists mostly of coniferous and deciduous forests, all planted or naturally regenerated from former plantations. And we also have some other types of nature coming under forest management. As for forest ownership, 50% of the forest is owned by the national and local government, 30% is privately owned, and 20% is owned by large conservation organizations. The forest management goals in Netherlands forests are mostly multifunctional. That means a combination of biodiversity conservation, recreation, and timber production. But that is very little because only 8.5% of timber consumption comes from Dutch forests in Holland. The major issues for forests are very high nitrogen deposition, which causes acidification of soils, and climate change that causes droughts, and we have also invasive species like ticks and Lyme disease. And also social issues are an increased and diversifying pressure on space for housing, for roads, for a lot of things. So we have a lot of spatial fragmentation and conflicts. Then another fact is that the citizens' involvement has been increasing in the late decennia, and that there are debates on specifically tree felling, which the public sometimes perceives to be excessive, There's a debate on rewilding with large herbivores in nature areas, and the question arises how care for the animals is best arranged. And then the third item, which provides hot discussions, is the return of the wolf. Since 2015, we have now over 100 animals. So that is the background in which forest managers have to operate. So indeed, how do they cope? When earlier research, I investigated the deeper motivations of foresters to choose their career and to stay in it. And I found that many of them were very deeply driven, and they consider their jobs as a vocation, not as just something to earn money. And they appear to have motives that could be considered spiritual. So first, in order to study forest spirituality, I had to first clarify what I was talking about, and I had to construct a suitable conceptual framework, a toolkit, and that became the first part of this research. The first question was to conceptualize spirituality. The problem with spirituality is that there is no general consensus about the definition of spirituality or religion. And some describe spirituality as hard to define and even avoiding definition at all. I understand you already had a discussion about conceptualization of spirituality yesterday. Yet what we can say is that spirituality has a certain core that can be God or nirvana or ultimate concern, but we cannot study that core empirically. What we can study is what people perceive of spirituality. So from research, we know that spirituality is ineffable. It can only be apprehended by experience. It is ephemeral, short-lived, a flash, but it can become profound and even life-changing at the same time. Spirituality can enrich the human and non-human spirit, is my belief. And it operates at the highest level of our value system, and as such it can be transformative. And scholars of religion have pointed out that nature is conducive to spiritual experience. So when we talk about spiritual values of forests, we can also term that forest spirituality. This term was introduced by a fellow PhD candidate, Jean-Liza Roux. Instead of a precise definition, I base my conceptualization on the so-called family resemblances approach, which classifies phenomena not according to a certain essence, but on likeliness, like kinship in a family. So this approach does not fuss about boundaries, what is spirituality and what is not, or what is the difference between religion and spirituality. We accept that these are and remain grey areas, but we leave them alone in the study. This approach does not put one tradition above another, but it focuses on the relations between humans or non-human beings and spirituality. So a framework also has units, and for these units I resorted to the religious scholar Ninian Smart. He became famous by describing religion all over the world using dimensions, the 7 dimensions of religion, and he wrote several books about it. I adapted them specifically for forest and nature spirituality on the basis of examples from literature. So finally, every framework has a design, and my design is simply a table where I combine these dimensions with other analytical units, for instance, elements of forest management, like, for instance, harvesting or tree planting or zoning. So, what are these dimensions of forest spirituality? Dimensions are characterized by the fact that they are not reducible to one another. In phenomena, one, more, or all dimensions can be present, and this presence can be strong, moderate, or weak, or any shade between. And the sequence of dimensions is not inherently important. As I said, the dimensions of forest spirituality are equally valid for all spiritual traditions. it does not encourage stereotyping, and it has consideration for complexity of spiritual issues. And it also helps not to reduce our research to simple instrumentalities. So I used most of SMART's 7 dimensions of religion one-to-one, with one exception, the experiential emotional dimension. This dimension is prominent in forest and nature spirituality in so many different ways that I subdivided this dimension in 4 sub-dimensions. So we have 10 dimensions altogether. The experiential dimensions are here on the left side in the orange field, and the other dimensions are on the right side in the purple field. To mention them briefly, we have the experiential aesthetical dimension, the experiential relational dimension, experiential restorative dimension, and the experiential life force dimension on the left. And on the right, the practical and ritual dimension, narrative and mythical dimension, the philosophical dimension, the ethical dimension, the social dimension, and the institutional dimension, and the, last but not least, the material and spiritual dimensions. So I will discuss each of these dimensions, and I will also use it to explain Dutch examples as far as possible. So the experiential aesthetical dimension contains the experience of wonder, fascination, self-transcending awe and sublimity through nature's beauty and grandeur. It also encompasses the experience of menace and fear emanating from forests, dark forests, and that also can evoke fascination. Not all natural beauty is a priori spiritual. According to literature, sublimity comes in levels, and only when it is experienced as sublime, or when it has the potential to raise a sublime spiritual experience, it might be classified as spiritual. Now, examples. There are many examples of literature about transcendental experiences in wilderness, in forest, sea and coast areas, dunes, fields. There's also some evidence from sports in nature, in wild water rafting, mountain climbing, mountain biking. That can also evoke elation and spiritual feelings. And not only dramatic landscapes can trigger spiritual experience, but also a simple flower can do that. So next comes the experiential relational dimension. And this concerns the experience of deep connectedness or oneness with the forest, trees, or land in general. And that relates to theories of sense of place and place attachment that are in turn connected to well-being and identity. And that has proven to be also a motivational factor for green behavior. The examples of this dimension are mostly found in education. I should first mention the Nature College, established by the Dutch Princess Irene, member of the royal family, who wrote books about nature spirituality. The aim of this Nature College is to achieve connectedness at all levels of education. Well, an offshoot of this Nature College was a nationwide program, NatureWise, that aimed to connect school children with nature. It is still going on and thriving. And the premise is that when children experience nature connectedness at a young age, they will develop a positive attitude and behavior towards nature in their later life. Another offshoot from the Nature College was the special chair at Wageningen University, which is now held by Professor Maria Tengu since 2022. And this is especially related to human-nature relationships and nature connectedness. Another organization that is active in education, nature education, is the IVN Nature Education Organization, but it aims at all ages, and sometimes it also touches upon spiritual connectedness with nature. And also, the Wageningen University is now offering more and more education of students in relational outdoor education and transformative research. And a totally different example of this relational dimension is the career choice as a forest manager, which I mentioned earlier. Then we have the experiential restorative dimension. This is the experience of forests as refreshing, peaceful and quiet, and hence mentally and physically healing. Well, that nature is good for health has been quite well supported by research. The spiritual component is not always clear, but there are positive indications, as pointed out by a leading environmental psychologist, Professor Agnes van der Berg. She wrote a host of critical hardcore studies on nature and health and came to realize that spirituality is an important part of it. A drawback is that nature and health can risk medicalization of nature, commercializing. Examples. I can mention retreats and coaching in forests and nature. There's also the concept of vision quests, retiring in nature for spiritual enlightenment and knowledge of the self. We can also see many examples of ecotherapy, that is a psychological coaching in forests for people with mental problems or education. And what is gaining in popularity is meditative forest bathing, Shinrin Yoku, which also has good health effects and knowledge of the self. We can also see many. The last of the experiential dimensions is the life force dimension, which is the intuitive experience of subtle vital life energies in forests, trees, or landscape. They are often connected with sacred sites, and they come under different names, like chi, ki, prana, mana, ether. They're also known as earth mysteries, the Chinese concept of feng shui or geomancy. And these energies also appear in animistic indigenous traditions, for instance in the songlines of the Aborigines in Australia. And in the landscape they appear as ley lines, power lines, or such names, sensed by dowsing or pendulum work. In the Netherlands, several publicists are working with vital energy, like Maya Koistra, Jeroen Heindijk, who wrote books about the subject. Some also work with balancing disturbed energies, notably Hans Andeweg in the Netherlands, and in Slovenia Marko Pugacnik, who applied lithopuncture in his earlier work, poles on certain ley lines or vital points in the ley lines. So now we come to the practical and ritual dimension. That means formal or less formal actions of a ritual character. The purpose can be developing spiritual awareness or ethical insight. This dimension is closely related to experiential dimensions. The forest can be a stage for the rituals, for whatever purpose, or there can be rituals on behalf of forests anywhere, like rituals for the conserving of the tropical rainforests. Examples are manifold. There is tree planting done as a sacred deed. There's tree worship and tree healing, tree ordination, as you can see on the picture in the Buddhist tradition, to preserve trees from cutting. There are shamanistic rituals to contact the tree, forest, and nature spirits for healing and even for land use decisions. Forest retreats, meditation, the forest monks in Thailand who have to survive in the rainforest. And what is rising in popularity enormously in the Netherlands are natural burials. Now in the Netherlands there are 25 sites existing, and there are 9 more sites in development. They're mostly offered by private owners and nature conservation organizations to ensure long-time conservation and to raise money for maintenance and for management. So next comes the narrative and mythical dimension. This comprises vital stories, myths, legends, histories, and other texts with spiritual meaning, oral or written. They're handed over from generation to generation. They're often connected with a sacred origin in terms of place or persons, and with sacred actions and purposes. Storytelling can be also a sacred act in itself. And also symbols and life-marking moments like initiations come under this dimension. This dimension is also strongly related to the practical and ritual dimension. As for examples, we have the sacred scriptures, the Bible, Quran, we have poetry, songs, and important themes are creation stories, where does the world come from? The position of mankind on Earth, like the songlines in Australia, as I mentioned before. They're also a practical guide to navigate the landscape, but can also be metaphorically interpreted. They can also be about saints, heroes, ancestors, as inspiration and examples for followers. They can provide comfort and inspiration. For instance, the readings of the Bhagavad Gita during the Chipko actions against deforestation in the 1980s in northern India. And it is noteworthy to tell that in Netherlands there are numerous books on forests and trees for sale in shops, and somehow people seem to be yearning for stories about trees and spirituality. And there is the philosophical dimension, which is the intellectual underpinning of experiences, rituals, and narratives. Here we enter the field of environmental philosophy, green theology, including the indigenous eco-spiritual philosophies. It also has to do with worldviews. How do we see the world and humankind's position in it? And with ontologies. What is the world? Do we all live in the same world? Or do other beings perhaps live in different worlds? Examples. One example is the biophilia hypothesis, stating that love for nature is anchored in the human genes to safeguard evolutionary fitness. Of a totally different character is the papal encyclica Laudato Si by Pope Francis, which links spirituality with nature conservation and poverty alleviation. Then we have, for instance, also deep ecology, which theorizes the profound connectedness of all beings, and which can also only be apprehended by spiritual awareness, according to some. We can also think of nature spiritualities that are probably entertain very close connections with nature. Druidism, Wicca, aspects of animism can also be under this dimension. And last but not least, the green theology by Sally McVeigh, and in Netherlands also by Van Montfort, about the Christian view on nature. Next comes the ethical dimension, which is spiritual inspiration leading to action, for instance, to decide to adopt a green lifestyle. Here we enter the field of environmental ethics, as far as spiritual inspiration for environmental ethics are concerned. A case in point are religious injunctions to care for land, vegetation, animals, to plant trees, as mentioned in, for instance, the Hadith, Deuteronomium, etc. And in some way we can also consider religious food laws as spiritual ethics. Well, as for examples, we can again mention the inspiration for the Chipko movement in India, There is also the Guilas system. I'm not sure I pronounced it right, but this is a philosophical system of the Heiltsuk First Nations in British Columbia, which encompasses all spheres of life and resource use. Then there are also spiritual aspects involved in the right of nature movements, rights for rivers, justice for forests, mountains, other phenomena. And in forest management, we can mention selective felling instead of clear cut on spiritual grounds by, for instance, private owners mostly. And also inspiration for green activism to protect forests, of course. In the Netherlands, there is a big case on the estate of Amelisweert, which is bordering a highway, which is every now and then threatened to expand into the area. And of course, we have climate activism in the broader sense. Now, we also have a social and institutional dimension, which is the embedding of spiritual dimensions in social structures, agreements, rules, contracts, or informal social interactions. This dimension also encompasses leaders, pastors, and gurus. And it also encompasses the organization of spiritual education and the organization of activism. The special case in point is what we call spiritual governance. In sacred areas, there's a movement not only give a voice in management to local people, but also to the local spirits, mainly through the intermediation of shamans. Well, other examples are, for instance, existing religious or spiritual organizations who turn green, like green churches, green mosques, and there can also be organizations for special eco-spiritual purposes, like Trees for Life, which is the rewilding of the Scottish Caledonian pine forest. This originated from Findhorn, a spiritual community dating from the 70s. I already mentioned the Nature College, and another initiative is students who made a deal with private forest owners to set aside pieces of forest so that piece of forest can take care of itself, so that forest that owns itself is not entered by humans and is left alone. Then pilgrimage to sacred places, the organization of that is also a case in point, and nature rights for sacred rivers and forests and other elements of nature. So last but not least, we have the material and spiritual dimension. This is the physical aspect of sacredness of landscapes, trees, forest, and nature. Forests can be a provider of sacred objects for rituals, etc. And it can also be a material object in itself. This dimension is closely related to the practical, ritual, and other dimensions. Well, examples, easy to find. Temples, tombs, holy places. You can see here the Osun Osogbo Sacred Forest, a World Heritage Site in Nigeria. And in the Netherlands, I picked up the green cathedrals. You can see there are trees planted in the shape of a church, and the resulting space is used for rituals, weddings, etc. Sacred art can be under this dimension, and sacred objects such as totem poles, shamanic objects, etc. So these were the 10 dimensions. How did we apply them in our research? First, I tested the framework in the study on forest management plans. So this concerned Netherlands and British Columbia, and I will therefore pass it by for the moment. In addition, there were also several master students who used the framework for their thesis work to study forest spirituality in different contexts. You can see them on the right here. But my third and last part of my research was the study of forest spirituality and the practice of forest management in the Netherlands. That's what I would like to highlight now. For this research, we carried out semi-structured interviews with forest managers in the Netherlands. It was COVID time, so most of the interviews were online, regrettably, but we had several field trips as well. And in this research, I distinguished managers of large public forest areas from private forest owners, because the decision-making structure is different according to ownership. Well, in addition, we got the opportunity to give a workshop at the National Area Managers Day in 2022, where we expected 30 people, but about 60 turned up. This served as a rapid appraisal and feedback to the forest managers we interviewed. Then I analyzed the data and I applied a network analysis to relate the spiritual dimensions to the management practices that were mentioned in the interviews. So what came out of it? So what were the results? And the first of our findings is that forests in the Netherlands are not only important for spiritual experience, but they are also increasingly used for ritual practices aimed at spiritual enrichment and health. Where it appears that ritual practices are not so problematic for private foresters. They often open their estates for groups seeking spiritual restoration and healing, but they can choose their visitors. Public foresters, on the other hand, can not control their visitors, as most forests in Netherlands have open access. So the managers face people doing all kinds of things, also rituals. And sometimes these rituals do not do harm. They're just quietly meditating, practicing yoga or that kind of thing. But sometimes also people follow ley lines and enter game refuge areas or leave remnants in the forests, flowers or even candles in the dry season, mind you. So also sometimes coaches come in with clients and even with groups, and they use the forest as their practice room. So when managers see that happen, they seek ways to get some remuneration too. If you earn your money in the forest, we'd like to have some contribution to our maintenance costs. Yeah, and sometimes there are conflicts with between spiritual users and other users like mountain bikers. And that can be mostly solved by a zoning of some areas when there is space. A second finding is that we found that ontological and relational considerations affect forest management practices in two entirely different ways. The first is diverging views on tree felling. The public has sometimes another idea about tree felling than managers. The managers look through an ecological lens, they say, and the public follows their emotions and see that a being is killed. Sometimes these views can be brought together a little by dialogues and sometimes excursions, and forest managers are learning their part, but sometimes also the controversies flare up. There's also another difference when it comes to educational programs. Education is an important part of foresters' tasks, but is education for experience or for deeper nature connectedness? In forest management policies in Netherlands, experience is a goal to reach as many people as possible to have them exposed to nature experiences. But that goal can be a little bit superficial and does not necessarily lead to lifestyle change or support for green issues. And that is one of the purposes or the rationale behind these excursion and communication policies. So On the other hand, research, as we have seen, research has indicated that when you have a deeper connectedness with forests, then yes, then there is a lifestyle change, but that needs some time and effort. So some forest managers have trained themselves in coaching to reach these deeper aspects of forest spirituality. A third theme what we discovered was that forest spirituality is expressed in local legends and historical monuments, and they're also deployed to raise the public's interest in forests. And let us also not overlook the dark side of history and, for instance, in World War II monuments that reveal, the still maybe painful side of history. Lastly, I already mentioned the ineffable aspects of forest spirituality, the life force dimension, which did not feature in any management plan at all, but emerges in occasional cases of intuitive forest management. And at least in 3 state forest sites, spiritual balancing took place, but no documents exist from the formal site. Now I come to the conclusions of my entire research project. And the first is that forest spirituality is not only significant for nature experience, but also increasingly for ritual practice and healing in the forest. I just mentioned that. Then forest spirituality is also significant for connectedness with nature and hence inducing green behavior. Forest spirituality is better operationalized in adaptive, values-led and other holistic forms of management planning than in formal technical planning structures. Both these aspects are necessary, and many forest units are already underway to involve citizens in planning, but it could be more. Not all forest spirituality is pleasant. For instance, history can evoke grief when it can live on in the present. So this and other forms of the dark side of spirituality should be recognized in planning and communication programs. Then, knowledge of forest spirituality in forest management may not only enhance motivation, but could also help to mitigate conflicts about forests, like the tree felling cases. Then the experiential life force dimension is virtually absent in the forest management plans, but appears in some forest management practices in the Netherlands. Not only in private forests, where they are a little bit more prominent, by the way, but also in some public forests, and its merits should be further investigated. Then, public foresters increasingly have to reconcile their management with the spiritual insights of a diversifying public. And last but not least, there is a need for education in forest spirituality among forest managers in the Netherlands. So to end, some recent insights and developments. Recently, Rebecca Troost, one of our master students, investigated forest visitors' spiritual dimensions. And she found that the most prominent dimensions were experiential restorative, philosophical ethical, and material spiritual. So she found also that visitors were motivated for a high ethic of care for the forest, but this was more inspired by a holistic worldview and identification with material spiritual aspects than by experience of oneness with forests, which goes against earlier research. Then there is the re-spiritualization hypothesis, already published by John Roux and others. And this means that there would have been a trend in the past, in the ancient past, of a high level of forest spirituality to which would go down and for a long time and is now rising again. So how true is this downfall and upward trend at the moment? At least in the global south, I doubt that the hypothesis holds. A colleague at my group in Wageningen is at the moment doing research on sacred forests in her home country and Cameroon in Africa. And she is concerned that so many sacred forests are disappearing. Well, in the global north, it may be different. We can see that public interest in forest spirituality is rising in the Netherlands and in Europe in general. I hope also including Lithuania. But the threats to the forest are also increasing. And I have good hopes that a brand new research project from Wageningen on forest spirituality and Eastern Europe will shed light on the matter. Just started. I just want to end with some words of hope. I'm not advocating spirituality as a universal solution, but we can only hope that a new generation will get opportunities for ecological knowledge and spiritual insights to make the world a better place for human and non-human beings. Our political constellation in the world and in the Netherlands is not very sunny for the near future of forests. So there will be interesting times to come.